All right. Well, welcome everyone to this community conversation. I'm Christina Burke, curator of Native American art at Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma, within the boundaries of Muskogee Creek Nation. And I'm joined today by Ruthe Blalock Jones, artist, educator, community scholar, and a member of the Oklahoma Advisory Board for the exhibition Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists. Hearts of Our People is on exhibit now at Philbrook and will be up through January 3rd. So this program is in connection with that particular exhibition. The show was co-curated by Jill Alberg-Yo from the Minneapolis Institute of Art and Terry Greaves, who's a Kiowa artist, community scholar, and independent curator, in conjunction with an advisory board of 21 women, artists, scholars, curators, etc. The show has been traveling the country from Minneapolis to Nashville, Tennessee, to Washington, D.C., and Philbrook is its last stop on this national tour. As I mentioned, Hearts of Our People will be up through January 3rd of 2021. We encourage you all to come see the show. This exhibition is organized thematically. The three themes are legacy, relationships, and power. And so in this series of community conversations, we will be focusing on those themes. So the first one today is legacy, and that's why I've asked Ruthe to join me today. So thank you, Ruthe, so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to you if you can tell us a little bit about your background, your education, your career, and then we can jump into this discussion.
Well, I am Shawnee. I'm also Peoria in Delaware, but I practice the ceremonies of the Shawnee tribe. Some of my work is based on Shawnee tradition and culture. And I did teach at Bacone College for almost 40 years. So I have known many of these artists over the years. And it's just a way of life, I guess you would say, as far as always being involved in art, either getting ready for a show or going to a show, or talking about a show, working with other people, you know, in their shows. And then at Bacone College, I was doing the same, but with and for the students. So that was a very great time.
And how long were you teaching at Bacone?
Well, actually, from 1979 until 2011, I believe it is.
Oh,
It was, if it's 10 or 11.
so you had a lot of students come through that art program.
It wasn't a large school, but I figured at one time that we have about 10% of the enrollment would come through the art department, but of the 10%, there would be only a small percentage that we would call art majors or really art students. But we did come in contact with a lot of students.
So given your career as an artist, painter, printmaker, and as an educator, you have a very broad and diverse perspective on the Native art world.
Yes. I have seen a lot. I've experienced a lot. And over the years, I've seen many changes. It's just an evolution, not just in art, but all around us. We see things that have changed, and they're just not what they once were. So.
Well, change can be good too. Thinking about people working in different media and experimenting with new techniques.
I was just thinking about Joan Hill, one of the artists in the show, And I was thinking I was dating both her and myself because she started her large pieces that would have ordinarily been done in watercolor on paper. She did them on canvas in acrylic. As acrylic paint came out, there are people who don't know that there was no acrylic paint, that it wasn't always here. So that was a change.
Yeah, so a lot of the early paintings by Native artists, early 20th century, are watercolor gouache on paper.
Yes. I'll be talking a little about the Kiowa artists, and one of the things they did was work with poster paint, the little jars,
Mm-hmm.
and they painted on almost anything, or maybe all artists do that, but they painted on wall boards, um, just almost anything. I myself painted on shirt cardboards and bakery sacks and window shades. I'm sure they did the same thing.
Great. Well, do you have some more names and knowledge you'd like to share with us today?
Sure, especially about this exhibit. There is no way I would attempt to critique it, but I just would like to say that it's so impressive in its scope and the diversity in the work that it presents. All of the work, in my opinion, is derived from ancestors. But I would like to mention also another Indian women's exhibit, which was called Watchful Eyes. And it was
Yes.
held at the Heard Museum in 1994. It was curated by Teresa Harlan. And I believe this show was one of the first, if not the first, Indian women's show. I'll simply tell you that what I know of the origin of American Indian art and look at a few pieces from the show that particularly appealed to me. As a painter, I of course selected paintings to talk about. And also I'd like to mention some pieces by women who are not in the show. And all artwork is contemporary at the time that it is done. Before there was art, before there was Indian art, there was angel decora. I mentioned to Christina that I was in art class with Dick West at Bacon College in the 1950s, and we heard of angel decora. I don't remember anything specific about her except that she was an artist and that we were to attempt to emulate her. So I didn't know much about her until I did some research in the 1990s. She was born in 1871. She was a Winnebago woman, and it was said that she was kidnapped from her Nebraska home as a child. And she was sent to Hampton Institute in Virginia, which is now Hampton University. The purpose was to strip her of her culture, to sever her family and a community or tribal ties, and force assimilation into Euro-American society. After she finished Hampton, she attended Smith College, and was one of the first American Indians to do so. We don't have the specifics of how she got to Smith, but apparently people befriended her while she was at Hampton, and in a way, took her into their family, I guess, and so they were instrumental in getting her to Smith College. Following Smith, she enrolled at Drexel Institute in Philadelphia. Her art instructor was the noted illustrator Howard Pyle, and he arranged a scholarship for her to go to North Dakota to paint Native people. She had been away since childhood, so this was mostly new to her. While she was there, she wrote and illustrated books. She did book covers and magazine illustrations. I think you have some of her work even.
I'm going to share screen and get to that slide here.
Okay.
Again.
In 1906, she went to Carlisle Institute to teach art. Carlisle was the school of Colonel Henry Pratt of Kill the Indians, Save the Man theme. While she was there at Carlisle, she traveled, she gave talks and presented papers on Indian life and design. This was during the American Arts and Crafts movement. Her work was Indian subject matter in academic illustration style, and she is one of the first, if not the first, Indian woman artist of record. She died of pneumonia in 1919. She was 48 years old. In 2003, Smith student Yvonne Tiger wrote of her, and I quote, "The invisibility of this Native woman artist living in a non-Indian world graduated from Smith College." She was admonishing her Smith people. But to me, the formal origin, if we could say, of Indian art, or its recognition as fine art and not curio or craft, in my opinion, occurred in Santa Fe and Anadarko in the 1920s, Anadarko, Oklahoma. There was the Santa Fe studio led by Dorothy Dunn, and in Anadarko at St. Patrick's Mission was Sister Olivia Taylor, a Choctaw Chickasaw nun who offered informal art classes. Also in Anadarko was Susie Peters. She was a field matron of the Anadarko Kiowa Indian Agency, and she organized an art club of Kiowa artists. They were Stephen Mopope, Jack Hokey, Spencer Asa, Monroe Toke, and Lois Smokey. Their work in the flat style and the work produced by the Pueblos in the Santa Fe studio led by Dorothy Dunn was similar in technique and theory, as it was based on familiar dancers, desert scenes, ruins, and kiva designs. The Kiowa's work was based on the buffalo culture, dances, Native American church, ledger drawings, and hide paintings. But both schools did the flat style with no background, or what the term I enjoy most is the Japanese quiet space. There were full figures in flat color, bordered by outline. There was some revolt at the Santa Fe school when Alan Hauser, one of the leaders of the group, complained that they did not like to be told what to paint by Dorothy Dunn. And Peters then brought the Kiowas to the attention of Dr. Oscar Jacobson, the head of the art school at the University of Oklahoma. He took them on as non-traditional students. They were given studio space, art supplies, and living quarters. I believe there was some instruction, but for the most part, they were on their own with occasional supervisory visits by Jacobson and Edith Mayer. I'm not sure about the Santa Fe, but the Kiowa artists were older. They weren't what we would call just out of high school. So they were young men. Lois Smokey was the youngest member of the group, and thankfully she's in the show here. You can see her work. She felt out of place, and she was made uncomfortable by the men who taunted her and said that she belonged in the kitchen. So she soon stopped painting and left the program to raise a family, and she became known as a fine beadworker. Because of her short time there, she produced, of course, fewer pieces than the men, and this caused her work to be in great demand by collectors, and they also commanded higher prices. In 1927, James Ogchai replaced her in the program. They became the 5 Kiowa artists when Jacobson arranged for their watercolors to be exhibited at the International Congress for Art, Education, and Drawing in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1928, where it was enthusiastically received as new art. Further spreading the gospel of Indian art, in 1929, Jacobson had a silkscreen folio of Kiowa Indian art published in France, and it was the first in a series of folios of Southwest art and other artists. These were published through the 1950s. The final folio was devoted to up-and-coming Jacobson artists in full college enrollment, such as Dick West and Oscar Howe. They were veterans taking advantage of the GI Bill, and so they were not non-traditional students as the Kiowas had been. And they were fully enrolled college students. In 1935, there was a Make Work program. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Federal Arts Project, FAP, hired thousands of artists to decorate government buildings, schools, hospitals, and libraries across the country. Many women artists were included in the FAP. However, I did not find any Indian women. In Oklahoma, 40 artists were selected, including Indians. And of the 40, 13 women artists were hired to paint portraits and Oklahoma Indian scenes. However, none of those artists were Indian women. The Oklahoma murals have been written about in book form by Nick Calcano from the Northeastern Oklahoma College at Miami, Oklahoma. Following the publication of these folios, These artists received commissions for murals in public spaces, such as the Oklahoma Historical Society, Oklahoma Historical Building in Oklahoma City, and the post office in Anadarko. A painting from the Anadarko post office called Kiowa's Moving Camp by Stephen Mopope was published in 2019 on a postage stamp. Indian artists, primarily from the Santa Fe studio, were in the group hired by the WPA FAP for murals in the new Department of Interior building in Washington, D.C. And these paintings are in the cafeteria of the building if you visit. The FAP employed many young artists, such as Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, Jackson Pollock, and others. Following the 5 Kiowas at the University of Oklahoma and the FAP, the art school at Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma was established in 1935. The founding art director at Bacone was the Jacobson protege, A.C. Blue Eagle, and he continued the Kiowa flat style of painting. It was refined into the Bacone school or style under other Jacobson students, Woody Crumbo, Dick West, and Chief Terry Saul. I, not from OU, followed in 1979 to 2011. There were women artists at Bacone College, and a few became professional artists, such as Virginia Stroud. We have some of her work. Joan Hill, who was in the show, and Sharon Aton Harjo. Sharon was an educator who taught art in Oklahoma City public schools. And Joan taught in Tulsa before doing art full time. Art is hard. Phyllis Fife was another one. Many others went into education and some went into museum work. Following World War II, the Philbrook Museum hosted the Indian Annual from the 1940s to 1980. In addition to being the premier showcase for Indian art for many years, this juried show was the only show. Philbrook Indian Annual was the only place to be for Indian art. The prestige of the Indian Annual cannot be overstated. By today's standards, the awards, while small, with first place being $100 and the grand award being $500, were extremely important and sought after. Most award winners sold on the night of the opening, and we're looking at a Virginia Stroud painting now, and this is one of the ones that was sold at the opening, I do believe, but it was also one of the award winners. The nucleus of many important private and public collections originated here, and many artists' careers were launched as well. Santa Fe and other regional shows, such as Gallup Ceremonials and Anadarko, Indian Exposition, were older. They were also in effect at this time, but they later opened their entries to the national Indian community. So they were, although they were in existence at the time of the Philbrook show, they were regional or local shows. Without, I think, these early Bambi artists, the flat style artists that we were just talking about, Indian art would have remained a curio or a craft for a long time, or much longer than it did. As we said, artists entered their best work. They had worked on it for a year. In the excitement of the opening night, some said this must be like being at the Academy Awards. At the opening, artists would slowly and carefully approach their entry, hoping to see a red dot denoting sold. Some sent a friend or relative to look and report back to them, as it was too emotional for them. Many women artists were in the Indian Annual and commanded as much attention as the men. Some of these were Pablita Velarde and the assumed Osage artist Jeffy Kimball, Joan Hill that we've already mentioned, Valjean Mccarthy Hessing, who are in this show, and Virginia Stroud and others. Some of them their work was so compelling that no one thought that they should be in the kitchen. And the women artists are present and in the forefront of all of these shows. Many schools made an effort to attract Indian students with the offer of Indian art classes. Most of the time, however, the classes were offered through the school or division of Indian studies. They were, for the most part, outside of the art department, as it was not fully accepted as fine art. This was a common practice and still goes on today. As the Indian Annual at Philbrook was groundbreaking in exhibits, its counterpart in schools is the Institute of American Indian Art, or IAIA, in Santa Fe. There's nothing to compare it to, as it was like nothing seen before in Indian art. It might fall somewhere in line with the Bauhaus or the Black Mountain College, where the students were doing farm work and construction work and work to pay their room and board, but also to give them practical experience. IA sets the tone and the space of Indian art, and it will for years to come. And several of the women in this show are IAIA alumni. Some of the women that I found interesting in the show are Jean Quick to See Smith. And let's start off with her name. Early on, women artists use initials instead of signing their name because of discrimination. Some used their maiden name and others followed convention and used their husband's name. My daughter, who is not an artist, uses her maiden name because she says she doesn't want any man to get any credit for what she has done. And this is Jean's work in the show that you can see in the show. I love the shaped piece shown here, and also because it's in my favorite color, blue. My all-time favorite of Jean's work is the paper dolls. I used this, I think, nearly every year in my classes at Bacon. It was quite controversial
Everybody wants to hear what Ruthe has to say. They're even calling on her phone.
I can set this off. I apologize if I can't get to it. This isn't a call.
Oh,
It's my
is it an alarm?
alarm for me to do my eye drops.
Okay. I'll remind you to get back to that.
Sorry, that shouldn't have even been in the room.
No worries.
We were talking about Jean's work and her paper dolls.
Mm-hmm.
And we're fortunate to be able to see them here today, thanks to Christina. And this was quite controversial and shocking at the time, even among Indians, because these things were not talked about openly. And if you can look at the date, she was marking the Columbus centennial, I believe it is.
I think this piece was 1991 or 92. So right, the Columbian quincentenary.
It was earlier than that. So when I saw it, it was new.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea Smith was a new name to me. I found her highly stylized work so meticulous and well done. The thing that was apparent to me was the amount of work that went into the piece and the time that must have been involved. I was also intrigued by her disturbing themes and titles of paintings, such as The Tasty Frenchman. I'm aware of the Wendigo stories from her tribe, which a lot of her work is based on. Many of these stories relate to or include cannibalism.
Mm.
Although I don't really know a lot about it, it is a supernatural being, I believe, similar to shapeshifters or night walkers or even the deer woman that all tribes have these types of figures, whether actual or imagined. And then when you look at Lois Smokey's work, and to me it seems more personal and intimate than the Five Kiowa Men. Even her colors are more sophisticated than the men. She certainly belongs in this show. And then we look back at Joan Hill. When she came to Bacone College for advanced study with Dick West, she already had her teaching degree, but she came to Dick West to learn the flat style. Although his work and Oscar Howes and Black Bear Boson, for instance, is not actually flat. While adhering to no background, I prefer, as I said, the term quiet space. She has bold, flat areas of color in her work, but it's contemporary in its use of the black outline rather than the darker shades of the dominant color. And also the fact that she was working with the new medium of acrylic paint, and she worked on canvas rather than watercolor on paper as the Kiowa artists had done. Her work is in her own interpretation and is all about her own time and place. And then we look at Valjean Mccarthy Hessing. Although she was college educated, unlike Joan Hill's study with Dick West, she was self-taught in the traditional style, which she took to new heights. And we have an example of her work here, probably from her Trail of Tears series, but there is no relationship. There is nothing to compare with this work and the work of the Kiowas. Their work is static, and it is flat, of course, motionless. We see motion here. We see different expressions on the faces, and it's a more realistic approach than the Kiowas. However, they were realistic in their day. Valjean was from Tulsa, so she studied the works of Dick West, Oscar Howe, Black Bear Boson, and others in the Philbrook and Gilcrease collections. She refined this flat style or traditional style, and she employed meticulous detail in her paintings. And one of the things that she was noted for was the depiction of fingernails. She once told me that she would work an entire day on fingernails. Her paintings were completed with sometimes as many as 5 outlines. Other Oklahoma women not in the show, as mentioned before, Virginia Stroud. She was adopted in the Kiowa way by Sharon Aton Harjo's family. So even though she is Cherokee, she is allowed to paint Kiowa themes or subjects. Both she and Sharon were, I believe, the first to bring the ledger style of painting among the Southern Plains tribes of Oklahoma. It had been present with their ancestors, but it hadn't been done for a while. As Indians would say, it was put to sleep. To see more of her work, you can, if you have an opportunity, to go to the Three Rivers Indian Clinic in Muskogee. There's a fabulous collection of her work. And also at this time, there is a show at the University of Oklahoma, Fred Jones Museum of the Kiowa art from their collection. Another excellent Oklahoma artist was Marlene Riding-In Mamiya. She had studied with Dick West at Bacon, and she was a very good painter. And she later took up silver work. She excelled in German silver, and particularly made peyote jewelry. I would be remiss in not mentioning the late Comanche artist Juanita Patapony, who was a member of this committee. Her work always stood out in creativity while still being Comanche. This illustration, I don't really know the story of the stars, but it's common in Comanche visuals. And if you recall, the Quanah Parker house has a star on the roof. Um, Anita was an educator. She was a poet and a writer and a Comanche traditionalist. And we miss her. Other artists, another that we will mention is Phyllis Fife. She was a Creek artist who also was from the Institute in Santa Fe. And for a while, she stopped painting and devoted herself to education. Indian women artists are here to stay, and some of them have never or rarely been in a kitchen. Yahweh, thank you very much. Do you have any questions or comments? Christina will take care of you.
Well, thank you so much, Ruthe. That was a great overview of Native American painting from the past 100 years or so. My goodness. If anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. But I really appreciate Ruthe coming in today and sharing that knowledge with us, and in thinking about not only the creative production of these Native women artists over the years, the decades, the generations, but also thinking about the many ways that their work has been shared with the world, whether it's through exhibitions and museums, through markets and galleries, through book illustrations and covers, as well as in the classroom. So there's been and continues to be a number of ways that the work of these Indigenous women is shared broadly. And one of the things that Ruthe and I were talking about, in particular, thinking about Angel Decora's career, but also the reach of her work as a book illustrator and as someone whose work was seen on the covers of books. Think about how often those books were published and how widely distributed they were, so that people didn't have to go to a market or a gallery or a museum show. Her work was seen throughout the country. And so thinking about the impact of that, as well as the Kiowa artists, and in particular Lois Smokey, working with Professor Jacobson at OU, and the publication and exhibition of their work, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. So we do have a question here. First, a word of thanks, Ruthe, for sharing that. And let me see, can you talk about the importance of generational work, like you, your children, and your grandchildren, and how we are all connected in the Oklahoma art world?
That is the question?
That's the question.
Well, I think all of my children and my two granddaughters are artistic. My oldest granddaughter just exhibited here in the Hardesty Art Center. We had one of the outstanding pieces, I think, in the show. But all of my children, when they were growing up, had to make something to enter in shows. And they called me Mean Mama. But they made, some of them made paintings and some of them made crafts. And two of my children sold their work in, I think in the Scottsdale show. And a few years ago at the Indian market in Santa Fe, a gentleman came up to me and brought one of the paintings that he had purchased from my son at the market. He didn't give it to me, but he brought it for me to see. It was quite nice to see that, because as soon as I got old enough or into high school, they stopped that, you know. Mm. But later on, both of my sons have worked in design. They worked in photography. And my other daughter works in quilting and all kinds of sewing. She does original sewing from leather. She made Christmas ornaments last year of stuffed animals made of leather. And there's just no end to her creativity. You never know what she's going to come up with next. And I'm not alone. Many of the women, children, did the same thing, and some of them. I'm thinking of Mary Horsechief over in Tahlequah. Two of her, Dan Horsechief and Mary Catherine, are actually professional artists. Dan is very well known, having won a number of awards. And if you're in Tahlequah and you go to the Northeastern, the large 20-foot sculpture of Sequoia is done by Dan, who was also one of my students. That in there. And several of the women, their children, although maybe they didn't stay with it like mine did, but they were involved in art early on.
And various kinds of art. So I know one of your granddaughters is a dancer.
Yes, she's the same one that did the painting at print at the show. She is a dancer, yes.
Well, we have another question asking what inspires you these days, whether in Oklahoma or beyond?
Well, it's always been not just daily activities, but a life experience. I guess my father was involved with the Native American Church, so I have pursued depictions of that and the designs. I'm inspired by our Shawnee ceremonials and just powwows and dancers and just daily life in general.
Well, I know there's one of your paintings that was in a Philbrook Indian Annual of Shawnees playing dice, thinking about daily life.
Yes. We could play that today because it's a winter game. It has to be put away in the spring.
Yes.
So we could play that today.
Well, are there other questions from our audience members? Don't see any others, but well, it's interesting to think about, Ruthe, you were talking about your inspirations of both dances and ceremonial activities as well as daily life.
Yes.
And we certainly see a range of that kind of work in Hearts of Our People as well. As well as a range of styles of work, from representational to abstract, including in historical objects. And I think this is one of the contributions of this exhibition, looking at abstract work by Indigenous women, whether it's painted on an Arapaho parfleche or quilled or beaded into various kinds of objects, looking at the history of abstraction in Native communities and specifically by Native women.
Well, we thought that abstract art was new a few years ago, but when you stop and think of it, Indian artists have been doing it for a long time. And the reason for that is that there are certain things that we don't talk about. There are certain things that are not shared. And so they can allude to these things in design and all. And so that becomes that type of work. And it becomes a design, but it's not just done in and of itself. It has a background.
But that background, that meaning, that understanding would only be comprehended by community members and not by folks outside the Native community.
Some of it, yes, yes. Uh-huh.
Well,
That was one.
anything?
That was one of the things that intrigued me with the Andrea's paintings. That
Mm,
sort of, dealing with the unknown or the unspeakable,
mhm.
but she brings it out. Just amazing.
There's a lot of powerful work in this exhibition and by Native women in general. And we're grateful to be able to have this show at Philbrook during this really challenging time. As some people may know, originally this exhibition was supposed to open in June, but of course then the world turned upside down. And for a while we weren't sure if we were going to be able to bring the exhibition to Oklahoma at all. But there was a lot of behind the scenes work going on this summer, and we're really grateful to everyone involved, the co-curators, the organizing exhibition, the advisory board members, the local community advisors who have helped us bring it here to Tulsa and be able to share Hearts of Our People here in Muskogee Creek territory. So the show is open to the public. Because of safety concerns, we are requiring advance tickets. So you can go online to philbrook.org to find a time that suits you to come to see the show in person. We're also doing a series of virtual programs like this conversation with Ruthe to add more interpretation and additional voices to the exhibition. So we appreciate you all coming today and joining us. Please watch for more conversations, programs, and activities. And we thank you so much for joining us. Ruthe, thank you. We appreciate it.